Cool. So welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about web extensions. I know the talk was marketed as specifically only about Chrome extensions, but we'll be kind of talking about Chrome extensions and web extensions. My name is Riaz, by the way. I'm a freelance web developer. You can see more of the stuff I've been working on at riazv.me. I've kind of worked across a bunch of industries, but most recently I was CTO of this company here, LoadUp, and I sort of finished that just a few months ago. But let's just kind of talk about the overall goal of the presentation. Even though we're going to talk about the specifics of web extensions, the goal overall is just to kind of inspire you to look beyond the typical ways that you might be using JavaScript to build, full stack or just front end web apps, and realize there's actually a lot of stuff you can do with the skills you probably already have, right? There's a series of talks I'm kind of planning on, like React Native, Chrome extensions, doing working with Google Homes and Alexas. Like, there's just a lot you can do with just JavaScript. It's really kind of fun to know that durable little language. So anyways, before I move on, when I say extension, I want to be very clear about what I mean. Most of you, if you have Chrome, and even some of the other browsers, those things in the top right corner that you can kind of add ad blockers or extensions to help you find coupons or 1Password, like there's 1,000 different use cases for these things. That's what a extension is. It's sort of literally extending the browser's functionality. So extensions actually have a pretty long history. Now, ironically enough, the first browser to have extensions was Internet Explorer in 1999. And then, but it looks very different than it does today. It was added in Firefox in 2004, Opera in 2009. Chrome, which kind of owns the lion's share of the web extension market today, it only really started supporting them in 2010. And then 2010 as well on Safari, and then 2016 in Edge. Now, the one thing I just want to point out is when I say they all supported extensions, the current approach is what's called the web extension spec, or even though the spec is not finished, the browsers are kind of centralizing on that. These original implementations often did not look like the current extension spec. You often needed something aside from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to write web extensions back in the day. But today, it's essentially everyone has kind of given up hope of their own thing and adopted the way that Chrome does it. In fact, most of them even say on their websites, like if you go to the Edge website, it's like, hey, here's an easy way to port your extension from Chrome. And I know it seems like the end of the world. Even on Apple's website, they specifically mention it. They've even written a converter to help you convert your extensions that you've written for Chrome into something compatible for Safari. So it's a little haywire of a world where everyone just recognizes no one's using anyone's extensions except for Chrome's, and they're all kind of like making it easy for you to, they're sort of all adopting that API. We're going to talk about that in a second. So this is kind of what I was talking about, with the web give it, the take it away. We kind of get these extensions, but they're all incompatible at a time. And so the way it's actually kind of getting better is once everyone kind of gave up on this concept that they're going to have developers focus on writing extensions in sort of these more native APIs to just each individual browser. In 2015, there was a committee set up at the W3C to finish a spec called the Web Extension Spec. They've kind of put out some drafts. They've never finished, but as a result, what's kind of funny is in 2015 for Firefox, 2017 for Edge, and 2020 for Safari, they've all just been like, all right, we get it, like it's not working. We're just all going to essentially adopt the Chrome's way of doing things. And even Chrome themselves have just within the last year done a complete overhaul of how they're going to do things. And now these browsers that said we'll do things the way Chrome does it are again kind of left with using what they call Manifest version 2. That's how almost all Chrome extensions are made today. Manifest version 3 is what they just said everything has to change in 2020. It's very similar to if you've done Angular. They essentially dropped Angular 1 and said, oh, we have to rewrite everything for V2. In this case, Manifest V2 versus Manifest V3 is a dramatic shift. The only one that outside of Chrome that's kind of supported this completely new way of writing extensions is actually Firefox, who started working on it. Everyone else is like, we just figured out V2. So that's a whole bunch of talk. Let's just talk about how we make extensions. So as I mentioned, modern extensions, if we forget about all the legacy stuff, the things you need to know are things you probably already know. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. When you're using those extensions under the hood, like if it has a little pop-up user interface, that's an HTML interface. It's effectively like another page, but has some superpowers where it can run some things in the background. This is not always the case, but essentially if you're starting today, they all only require you to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Although the JavaScript part is a little bit unique than just a web page because you have to deal with the sort of service worker architecture for running things in the background. So when I say how do you make one, I can give you the simplistic answer, and then like there's the real answer every modern web developer wants, which is, yeah, I know I can write the plain stuff, but no one actually just directly writes all that stuff by hand. We all use frameworks, right? We use React or Angular or Backbone. So on that point, web extension frameworks aren't really a thing. There's really nothing to put here. Like, there's not like, here's why. Okay, this next thing. Yes, you can use React, Webpack, ES6, all of that. Like the last extension I wrote was called Listery, which I should put a link in the slides if you want to play with it. And like I'm using Parcel to actually package my stuff up instead of Webpack, and I'm using ES6, and I have all of that, and it is outputting at the end of the day, right, a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But there is no framework to do it. Like you essentially can find a boilerplate online or just write your own Webpack config. Because essentially at the end of the day, even if you build a website, you do all your stuff, and at the end you're like Webpack build, right? And it dumps out some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you can run that, which is just ES software. So how do you deploy your extension? Like how do you get someone in the interwebs to actually use it? Well, this part gets a little bit trickier. So with the internet, right, you would assume, hey, I just buy a domain, I build a website, I find a hosting provider, and I push up my website to the domain. Actually, I'm going to pause here because I'm going through this pretty quickly. Does anyone have any questions so far? I can't actually see your chats, in case you're putting it that way. But if anyone wants to, let me actually go switch over there. Yeah, I didn't put Brave on there. Brave would be a Chromium-based browser, and I didn't research how it handles extensions. I assume that it's also using a very similar, all the Chromium-based browsers are going to have a very Chrome-esque extension interface. All right, so I'll jump back to said slides now. I'm weirdly proud of this little thing. This is not something I found. I actually built this by hand. Each of these freaking blocks of things is actually like a little SVG I found, and then all the other things, they line up perfectly. But like, it took some time, guys. Okay, so some of the browsers will let you kind of sideload. Like if you can self-host your extension via Firefox. You still have to go through this like process to get it signed by them, which means you can't still get out of the walled garden, and you can distribute it through your own server. It's kind of tricky to do so, but for the most part, if you imagine, you're probably going to the Chrome Web Extension Store, the built-in sort of extension tooling in Firefox, Safari, Edge. So essentially, think of these as almost similar to app stores. They all run their own. It is in almost all of the processes to submit and deploy your extension. It's not a free-for-all. Like even Google, right? Like Google, compared to how easy they make for you to put up an Android app, make it really actually complicated to put up a extension. Like if you've ever done an iOS app, you actually have to like submit your app to Apple and get it reviewed by a person and get them to approve it. That's how it works here. Like if you're putting a new extension in any one of the stores, they're all going to have their own review process. Some of them require you to pay to be a developer in their ecosystem, similar to the way that you have to pay, I think, $25 to be an Android developer and $100 a year to be an iOS developer. You have to actually, they're generally pretty low, and some of them are free. But you have to realize like you are at the will of Google or whatever. In fact, one of the things is that Google now has a thing called enhanced protection or something similar in their extension, in their browser, starting Chrome. If you enable it, if you are a brand new Chrome extension developer, you can actually go through the approval process, be on the Chrome Web Extension Store, and your extension next to it will say this thing is unsupported or is not trusted, because like you haven't been a web extension developer for long enough. And they're like, yeah, once you've been around for a few months and like we realize you're not scamming people and like abusing your extension, then we'll take away that label. So you're very much at the whim of the different browser vendors. So this is the part where we get to some code. So those three terms don't make much sense right now if you've never written an extension, but those are the three steps we're going to go to. Every extension is simply a manifest, background or pop-up scripts, and then you have to load it into your browser. So we're going to do all those. Now this part you can all follow. I'm not starting with an existing code base. I'm actually going to be starting with something from scratch. So this is actually the completed version. but I'm going to see if I can remember all this by heart. And we are just going to start with a brand new project. So this tooling, if you're not familiar with it, it's just an editor. I normally write Ruby, so I just tend to work in RubyMine. But we can, of course, write any sort of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we will go and do that. Now, the other thing you will need, if you're going to follow along, is you will need Chrome. So, and if you're in Chrome, if you've never been to where you manage your extensions, you can just type this in, Chrome extensions, or if you go to settings, you can go to the extension screen. In fact, let's just do this, get a cleaner environment. Yeah. All right, cool. So this is just sort of a brand new user in Chrome, so there's nothing but the default. So I already had this enabled, but if you get to this page, Chrome :_ extensions or / extensions, on the top right, you'll see sort of a toggle for developer mode, which you'll want to enable. And that's going to make available these 3 additional options. Now, we're not going to use them yet, but we will in a second need the load unpacked, which is to load an extension from your computer for the purpose of testing and development. So now I am back in this sort of brand new project. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a new file. And we're going to call it the manifest.json. So this is like a declaration file. It has to be there in every extension. And this is actually the same file name for all of the 4 major browser vendors, or any alternatives that are also kind of Chromium based. They're going to have a manifest.json. When we need a couple of things in there. So we will need a name. Riaz's talk demo. Let's call that. Call it whatever you want. We'll need this. Now, we're not going to put anything in the action, and I'm not going to get too much into the detail of how this works, but you can essentially have it do an action thing on click in terms of opening a pop-up, etc. We're not going to do that. We're going to be using slightly a different version of this. Manifest version 3. Now, so I mentioned this, Manifest version 3, if you go look around about it, Chrome is the only one that currently fully supports it, and Firefox has started. Essentially, this is what I was talking about, where Manifest version 2 was how we've been writing extensions for a long time in Chrome and sort of Chrome-compatible extension browsers. Google was just like, no, we're going to change all this. I think it was like in October 2020, like if you started going to the Chrome extension website for Google, they were like, no, you should write them in Manifest version 3. And it's a complete kind of redo of how you write extensions. Like certain APIs are different, certain APIs are gone. And eventually, like I think Safari's like, we're not even bothering with it. Like it's just like, we just don't have time. But there's some benefits they proclaim. And so we're going to write in version 3, not in version 2. So we do need to declare a version of our extension, otherwise it won't import, even though you don't really need this actually until you deploy it to a store. And you do have a permissions model, like what you're requesting to be able to do in the user's computer. And for our little example, we're just going to need what's called active tab and big scripting. Copy that. And then the final thing we're going to do is declare a background tab. And we're going to declare that we'll need a service worker. And the service worker is going to be a file called background.js. So I'll leave this up for a second. I can also make it bigger, I think. I'm going to have to make it bigger. There we go. So I'm not sure if anyone's kind of following along. I'll just leave it for a few seconds as I talk. We're going to now make the background.js file. That's actually the one that'll be the only kind of file in our extension that's the one doing the work. There's other things you can declare in this manifest. For example, like the image, right, for the little icon that you have, or other permissions. There's kind of pretty good documentation on the websites of the various browser vendors of sort of like how do you configure the manifest file and like what goes in it. So I'll go from there to background.js. And it's going to only have a few pieces on it. So we're going to have a function called redden. So the thing our extension is going to do, and this is actually taken from one of the getting started guides somewhere, we're just going to take it so that whenever you click the button, it reddens the page, whatever page that we're on, which is kind of a fun thing to do to people. So So we'll just do document.body.style.background color equals red. This is just plain JavaScript. Nothing going on special there. Now this is where it gets a bit unique, and this is where you get these kind of magic pieces of context included in your script because you're running as a Chrome extension. So we're going to do chrome.action.onClicked.add_listener, and even though we're not transpiling, we do get to use sort of arrow functions because we know we're going to be running in a Chromium context, so we don't really need to worry about transpiling down. So we should be fine here. So we'll do chrome.scripting.execute script. Yeah. And I think from there we will have an object. Target is tab ID, tab.id. Now I'm typing fast, but I'll leave this up for in a second after this. I probably did screw it up, so you'll probably get to come back to the screen in a second. I think this is everything I need. So I'll make this bigger. Oh, hold on. We should probably make sure this runs, and then you can come back, and I'll because it probably just doesn't work at all. So I'm going to go back here. We're going to go to load unpacked, and go back here. It's untitled directory that we did. So again, it's just the directory I'm selecting that has our manifest.json and the background.js. Good, it loaded. Otherwise, sometimes it'll error because we did some glitch. Again, we don't have an icon we've included, but this extension does show up here. I'll just pin it to make it easier. Let's see if it works. Whoa, okay. Got it right the first time. Cool. Super tiny, but I'll jump back to the screen in case anyone has anything else they want to look at. So I'll just pause right here for anyone who wants to unmute themselves or put something in the chat if they've got a question.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there a way make changes live, like a reload server?
No. So for example, are you asking like, hey, like imagine that you are doing some development. So like imagine you change this to purple, right? That doesn't, even if I reload this page, right, and I run the extension, it's still going to be red. Like the only way to get it to load your code again to test your extension is you have to hit this either reload icon or you have to hit the update button, which will try to update all your extensions. So if I reload it, it's now reloaded to get the newest one, and then if I kind of try it again, now it's purple.
Okay, so there is not like a reload server?
No, no. Nope, there's no way to like, I mean, I wonder if there's some command line way to tell Chrome, an existing instance of Chrome, to reload its extensions. I would imagine Google doesn't like that, like to have command line control of a user opened browser. So if there is a way to do that, then I guess that would be the way to give it, like, essentially a command line interface to say, please update, like tell Chrome to reload the extension. I did not find anything like that. Now the other thing, just to quickly move on before I just go back to the last couple slides, debugging, right? So imagine we had a bug in here. Like imagine we did that, right? So this is not going to work correctly. So how would I test this? So I've only found one way. It should break. Let's make sure it does break. Yep, it broke, right? And you're like, whoa, I can't see what's going on. Like essentially, there's this context, right, of the extension. How do I actually verify what it's doing? So there is the thing. Here's what's actually happening. This thing runs and dies, right? So errors and dies. The only way for us to like inspect this, right, is it needs to live long enough for us to open a page to inspect it, or you can try to add some sort of like Sentry error handling. So what I ended up doing was kind of something like this. So I set this like global timeout in the extension I wrote, and again I would use an environment variable to say like I only want this to happen in development. So like you could do This I did not plan to put in the presentation, but it just kind of feels really relevant to the question you asked in some ways about like what's the developer experience. So the fact that this only occurs in 3 seconds gives me enough time to open the sort of running context and inspect it. I think. So, wait, there it is. Okay, service worker. It may have already run. Or not. I wonder if it actually left that there. This is where I'm like truly like off the rails. I did not like actually plan for that. I didn't actually use a background page. I was actually using the action to open an actual page as a little pop-up and having to do this. But yeah, the reason, seeing this, I'm doing some, there we go. Cool. And then, all right, well, I will just say that the sort of debugging process of contexts that are booting up to do this stuff is a pain point. And I guess this is a perfect demonstration of that. You kind of have to, like, if you're running a background page that's supposed to be this context right here, this service worker, right? And like this console is supposed to be the context of that background JS when it runs and it errors. Now, the other thing that happens is if you, in your manifest.json, instead of writing a background worker, you can say, hey, action is on click, like open this page. And that's when you can sometimes have extensions that open little UIs when you click on them, like a pop-up or something. And then you can right click on that and say inspect, and then you can get access to the console there. But I had to do some fiddling and some Googling of like, what are other people doing to get access to these like JavaScript contexts and figure out, because it's not going to show up here. It's not going to, it's just, yeah, there is, by default, it won't show up here if it's a page that's ephemeral, opening and closing. So, let me jump back to my slides. So, cool. Oh, that's the very last thing I had. Yeah, I love this. I love this GIF here.
Hey, Riaz, I had a question.
Yeah.
Okay, if you go to your console once more, your browser console.
Yeah. You're talking about like if you can switch the context over.
Sometimes I see that extension of delete.
That's if they're, oh yeah, so if they're running as content scripts, yes, then you can. That is another capability of a thing. So have you ever like used an extension that like is actually running code on your page and modifying it, right? Like there's an extension for GitHub, for example, to like that runs on the page and like is able to enhance the existing page. In which case they actually are running on the page, and then yes, then you can see them here. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
I may have one. I think I do have like refined GitHub, which we'll see that. Yeah, so refined GitHub. There we go. Yeah. So see, this refined GitHub is actually like interacting with the current page that I'm on and modifying it. That's I think what's called a content script, and that's another like, so Chrome extensions, you know, they have like, you can work in the background, they kind of run their own. You can run as a pop-up, which means they kind of open their own pop-up, as well as running as a content script where they're sort of registered. It's like, hey, I want to register to be able to mess with things or read things on this domain. So like refined GitHub, for example, is one that like adds like this little icon here and has a bunch of settings. So it actually is running on the page. Now it's sort of running in its own JavaScript context. But because it's affecting the page, you actually do get the ability to inspect it there. Yeah. Does that make sense? That's a good question.
Can we use third-party libraries to code we have written?
In terms of like NPM libraries?
Yeah, NPM
yeah.
or Angular or anything like that.
Yeah, you know, I'm just going to open up an extension I wrote. So kind of the answer is that if you think of like the web, right? Like you can write plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We've all kind of moved away from that, but we've moved away from that with Create React App and Next.js and Vue CLIs and stuff like that, where they're doing all this work where you can write one thing, they compile it down to ultimately still HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There isn't a kind of out of the box tool to help you do that. So you can kind of like in terms of frameworks that are like build tool frameworks, there's a lot of boilerplates out there. But like what I did in this particular case, that's the wrong repo. Yeah. Listery is a tool I wrote that's, I don't want to go into the details of it, but like it's just a Chrome extension kind of tool. This is actually the Chrome extension code. And I was like, yeah, like I want to be able to like have code in different places and have like, import statements, stuff like that, right? Export and import, all that kind of stuff. And you can't do that unless you transpile. So like I kind of rigged my own thing using Parcel. And then I essentially have like these little scripts I wrote to say, okay, dev means like copy the static stuff and watch this file and then output it to like this dev. And then the thing I'm actually like mounting is this dev. So like this stuff, mounting in terms of the thing I'm kind of saying is the Chrome extension is this distribution directory. And yeah, you still have a manifest.json, and now you've got these compiled assets. Chrome doesn't care, it just cares that it's been compiled. So because I've got a build tool now, like I can have actual like imports, exports, node modules, whatever. If I import the node module right into one of these files, it's just going to end up in this index.js at the end. Chrome doesn't care, it just thinks of it all as JavaScript, right? So the answer is yes, but unlike if you're using React or Vue, whatever, you kind of have to create the build system yourself. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so you were saying that we can compact kind of like the whole JavaScript in a single file? Like
sorry, say that again?
So you were saying we can use all those JavaScript codes and pack them in a single file?
Yeah. So like basically the answer is you can use them, but the way you're probably using them today is that like you're like, okay, npm install, and then you just refer to that is an import, right, in your whatever framework code, and Webpack is automatically like, aha, I see you're importing from a library like an absolute path. Let me go look in the node modules and find that code, right? That whole Webpack setup is just a thing that doesn't come out of the box. So you have to come up with you have to find someone else's boilerplate where they've already configured Webpack, or do your own. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So in that case, is there any sort of limitation of file size or something?
There is a limitation on sort of like your deployment. There's some number of megabytes. Like I think there's like a limit that would just be put up by the store, right? So like, how big can like Chrome extensions size limits? Like each of the extension like vendors will have like how big can your extension get. And the CRX file, by the way, if you've ever seen that before, is for a Chrome extension, just like a packaged Chrome extension. It's simply a zip file behind the scenes, I think, or it's a okay, yeah, I guess Chrome limits it to 2 gigabytes. Yeah. This is the web store. So there's no technical limitation from the extension side, but if you're distributing it on the Firefox store or the Chrome store, like they're going to have a policy of how big your extension can be. And that makes big meaning like if you're using a ton of libraries, right? All that code is getting bundled into your, let me leave it here. All that code is getting bundled into your extension. And so there's just a limit to whatever they're willing to accept. Any other questions?
I have a question. How is the widget cost on using TypeScript when we're creating a web?
Yeah, so you can use TypeScript. This works in the same way, right? Because even if you are writing TypeScript in a web app, eventually the TypeScript compiler runs, and as the output, the thing that's actually shipped, to your website is just plain JavaScript. So if you can rig your own build system to use TypeScript, then you're good to go. It's just that like today, the process of you writing TypeScript to potentially like getting it to the web. There's a whole lot of steps in between, and there's really good, well-supported solutions. So again, think of Create React App, think of Next.js, Next.js, all those different tools. They make it super easy to do that compilation and deployment. Um, that work isn't done for you. You'll have to kind of use Parcel or configure Webpack yourself, or find someone else's example boilerplate that's already configured a TypeScript compilation process. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sure. You were talking about V2 and V3.
Yeah.
But even if Google didn't go to V3, still if you write something on using V2 on Google Chrome and you build a Google Chrome extension, if you're using, now you cannot use the same source code exactly as using I'm just going to the Firefox source, right?
So so they're still accepting V2 application. Google Chrome, the Chrome Web Store is still accepting Manifest version 2 extensions because this is a massive change. In fact, most of the really popular extensions have got tons of code. It's going to take them years to rewrite it. Firefox had a bunch of blog posts where they're starting to support a lot of V3, but they're not there yet. And Microsoft is also something similar. Safari just said they're sticking with V2 for a long time.
I guess my question is, if you write a Google Chrome extension using V2,
yes,
the source code, you cannot go and send it to the Firefox store.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So if you're like, hey, I want to write an extension and I want it to deploy to like as many of the other stores as possible, you should write it in V2. Because V3 has inconsistent support. It's just too new. Google is still accepting new V2 extensions as of my last understanding. So if you want the most compatibility, because everyone's adjusting to V3, you should write it in V2. That being said, if you're writing it in V2 and you're going to support this for many years, you're now kind of writing in a thing that has a sunset coming in the future, right? Like at some point you're going to have to rewrite it if you're going to keep maintaining it indefinitely.
I don't know if I did something wrong, but I wrote like 2 years ago like a Google using the API, Chrome, storage, everything about.
Yeah.
I don't think I was able. I tried to remember to put in the part, and it's a different API. Like even if using V2, it's just 50% or something. The other 50% will be translated. You have to rewrite it 50% of the code.
So this is actually a good point. Firefox has now shimmed most of the Chrome APIs. In fact, they've even got, like, they had a blog post out that, like, they're just now letting you use Chrome out. They're not even forcing you to rewrite. But you're right, there's some APIs they can't support in the same way. So you will have, I think that's a really good point in general, which is that, like, when you're saying, oh, I can write one web extension and deploy everywhere, they're still in the process of standardizing this stuff. So, like, it's somewhat likely that, like, oh, I just, gave them the same extension. It works. Way more likely that you're going to have to essentially keep a lot of things similar, but you're going to have to make like sort of forks for each of the different browsers, depending on how sophisticated your extension is. Like the one that we just wrote will probably work in Firefox today. But if you go look at the Firefox blog, there's like every release, there's like, oh, we now have direct compatibility with Chrome dot whatever, right? But even that, I only remember seeing in the last, year and a half. So I think the point would really be that area of cross-browser compatibility is like highly in flux and still in very active development, and it's a bit of a mess. So you're right. I would not count on being able to port my extension today. That's just the promise they're making. Safari literally released a command line tool to say, give me your Chrome one, and I will convert it and magically spit out a Safari compatible extension. I don't think it works. I've just heard people being like, it works like half the time. So yeah. I think this is why ultimately you haven't seen a dramatic uptake in extensions of like developers wanting to develop for the Safari, Firefox, Edge, etc. Edge is now basically just Chromium, so you kind of get like really good compatibility there. and I think it's that like, okay, so even with mobile, right? Like, there's enough pain point in having to develop for iOS and Android, which is two things that are so different that like we're like, all right, we're gonna create React Native and Ionic and all these things, right? But like, there just isn't enough money, enough of a user base of people who both like, let's say, use Firefox and want to use the extensions to justify the exact friction you're talking about, which is I need to make all these changes and I have to make it, and then I have to maintain this fork of this extension for each of the browser vendors. Um, so I think that's why they're working continuously on letting just becoming compatible with Chrome, um, which is funny because normally they don't work that way. They're like, oh, we're just going to pick one of the major browsers and just all follow along, but they're not there yet. So